This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 6. A Hero in Kaul. It was daylight when I was awakened by the sound of stealthy movement nearby. As I opened my eyes, Woola too moved, and coming up to his haunches, stared through the intervening brush toward the road, each hair upon his neck stiffly erect. At first I could see nothing, but presently I caught a glimpse of a bit of smooth and glossy green moving among the scarlet and purple and yellow of the vegetation. Motioning Woola to remain quietly where he was, I crept forward to investigate, and from behind the bole of a great tree I saw a long line of the hideous green warriors of the Dead Sea bottoms hiding in the dense jungle beside the road. As far as I could see, the silent line of destruction and death stretched away from the city of Kaul. There could be but one explanation. The green men were expecting an exodus of a body of red troops from the nearest city gate, and they were lying there in ambush to leap upon them. I owed no fealty to the Jeddak of Kaul, but he was of the same race of noble red men as my own princess, and I would not stand supinely by and see his warriors butchered by the cruel and heartless demons of the waste places of Barsoom. Cautiously I retraced my steps to where I had left Woola, and warning him to silence, signaled him to follow me, making a considerable detour to avoid the chance of falling into the hands of the green men. I came at last to the great wall. 100 yards to my right was the gate from which the troops were evidently expected to issue, but to reach it I must pass the flank of the green warriors within easy sight of them, and, fearing that my plan to warn the Kaulians might thus be thwarted, I decided upon hastening toward the left, where another gate a mile away would give me ingress to the city. I knew that the word I brought would prove a splendid passport to Kaul, and I must admit that my caution was due more to my ardent desire to make my way into the city than to avoid a brush with the green men. As much as I enjoy a fight, I cannot always indulge myself, and just now I had more weighty matters to occupy my time than spilling the blood of strange warriors. Could I but win beyond the city's wall, there might be opportunity in the confusion and excitement which were sure to follow my announcement of an invading force of green warriors to find my way within the palace of the Jeddak, where I was sure Mata Shang and his party would be quartered. But scarcely had I taken 100 steps in the direction of the farther gate, when the sound of marching troops, the clank of metal, and the squealing of throats just within the city apprised me of the fact that the Kaulians were already moving toward the other gate. There was no time to be lost. In another moment the gate would be opened and the head of the column pass out upon the death-bordered highway. Turning back toward the fateful gate, I ran rapidly along the edge of the clearing, taking the ground in the mighty leaps that had first made me famous upon Barsoom. 30, 50, 100 feet at a bound are nothing for the muscles of an athletic earthman upon Mars. As I passed the flank of the waiting green men, they saw my eyes turned upon them, and in an instant, knowing that all secrecy was at an end, those nearest me sprang to their feet in an effort to cut me off before I could reach the gate. At the same instant the mighty portal swung wide, and the head of the Kaulian column emerged. A dozen green warriors had succeeded in reaching a point between me and the gate, but they had but little idea who it was they had elected to detain. I did not slacken my speed an iota as I dashed among them, and as they fell before my blade I could not but recall the happy memory of those other battles when Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, mightiest of Martian green men, had stood shoulder to shoulder with me through long, hot Martian days, as together we hewed down our enemies until the pile of corpses about us rose higher than a tall man's head. When several pressed me too closely, there before the carved gateway of Kaul, I leaped above their heads, and fashioning my tactics after those of the hideous plantmen of Dor, struck down upon my enemies' heads as I passed above them. From the city the red warriors were rushing toward us, and from the jungle the savage horde of green men were coming to meet them. In a moment I was in the very center of as fierce and bloody a battle as I have ever passed through. These Kaulians are most noble fighters, nor are the green men of the equator one whit less warlike than their cold, cruel cousins of the temperate zone. There were many times when either side might have withdrawn without dishonor, and thus ended hostilities. But from the mad abandon with which each invariably renewed hostilities, I soon came to believe that what need not have been more than a trifling skirmish would end only with the complete extermination of one force or the other. With the joy of battle once roused within me, I took keen delight in the fray, and that my fighting was noted by the Kaulians was often evidenced by the shouts of applause directed at me. If I sometimes seemed to take too great a pride in my fighting ability, it must be remembered that fighting is my vocation. If your vocation be shoeing horses or painting pictures, and you can do one or the other better than your fellows, then you are a fool if you are not proud of your ability. And so I am very proud that upon 2 planets no greater fighter has ever lived than John Carter, Prince of Helium. And I outdid myself that day to impress the fact upon the natives of Kaul, for I wished to win a way into their hearts and their city. Nor was I to be disappointed in my desire. All day we fought, until the road was red with blood and clogged with corpses. Back and forth along the slippery highway the tide of battle surged, but never once was the gateway to Kaul really in danger. There were breathing spells when I had a chance to converse with the red men beside whom I fought, and once the Jeddak Kulan-Tith himself laid his hand upon my shoulder and asked my name. "I am Dotar Sojet," I replied, recalling a name given me by the Tharks many years before, from the surnames of the first 2 of their warriors I had killed, which is the custom among them. "You are a mighty warrior, Dotar Sojet," he replied, "and when this day is done I shall speak with you again in the great audience chamber." And then the fight surged upon us once more, and we were separated. But my heart's desire was attained, and it was with renewed vigor and a joyous soul that I laid about me with my longsword until the last of the green men had had enough and had withdrawn toward their distant sea bottom. Not until the battle was over did I learn why the red troops had sallied forth that day. It seemed that Kulan-Tith was expecting a visit from a mighty Jeddak of the north, a powerful and the only ally of the Kaulians, and it had been his wish to meet his guest a full day's journey from Kaul. But now the march of the welcoming host was delayed until the following morning, when the troops again set out from Kaul. I had not been bidden to the presence of Kulan-Tith after the battle, but he had sent an officer to find me and escort me to comfortable quarters in that part of the palace set aside for the officers of the royal guard. There, with Wula, I had spent a comfortable night, and rose much refreshed after the arduous labors of the past few days. Wula had fought with me through the battle of the previous day, true to the instincts and training of a Martian war dog, great numbers of which are often to be found with the savage green hordes of the Dead Sea bottoms. Neither of us had come through the conflict unscathed, but the marvelous healing salves of Barsoom had sufficed, overnight, to make us as good as new. I breakfasted with a number of the Kaulian officers, whom I found as courteous and delightful hosts as even the nobles of Helium, who are renowned for their ease of manners and excellence of breeding. The meal was scarcely concluded when a messenger arrived from Kulan-Tith, summoning me before him. As I entered the royal presence the Jeddak rose, and stepping from the dais, which supported his magnificent throne, came forward to meet me, a mark of distinction that is seldom accorded to other than a visiting ruler. "Kaor, Dotar Sojet," he greeted me. "I have summoned you to receive the grateful thanks of the people of Kaul, for had it not been for your heroic bravery in daring fate to warn us of the ambuscade, we must surely have fallen into the well-laid trap. Tell me more of yourself, from what country you come, and what errand brings you to the court of Kulan-Tith." "I am from Hastor," I said, for in truth I had a small palace in that southern city which lies within the far-flung dominions of the Hellemetic nation. "My presence in the land of Kaul is partly due to accident, my flyer being wrecked upon the southern fringe of your great forest. It was while seeking entrance to the city of Kaul that I discovered the green horde lying in wait for your troops. If Kulan-Tith wondered what business brought me in a flyer to the very edge of his domain, he was good enough not to press me further for an explanation, which I should indeed have had difficulty in rendering. During my audience with the Jeddak, another party entered the chamber from behind me, so that I did not see their face until Kulan-Tith stepped past me to greet them, commanding me to follow and be presented. As I turned toward them, it was with difficulty that I controlled my features, for there, listening to Kulan Tith's eulogistic words concerning me, stood my arch-enemies, Mata Shang and Thurid. "Holy Hekador of the Holy Therns," the Jeddak was saying, "shower thy blessings upon Dotar Sojak, the valorous stranger from distant Hestor, whose wondrous heroism and marvelous ferocity saved the day for Kaul yesterday." Mata Shang stepped forward and laid his hand upon my shoulder. No slightest indication that he recognized me showed upon his countenance. My disguise was evidently complete. He spoke kindly to me, and then presented me to Thurid. The black, too, was evidently entirely deceived. Then Kulan Tith regaled them, much to my amusement, with details of my achievements upon the field of battle. The thing that seemed to have impressed him most was my remarkable agility, and time and again he described the wondrous way in which I had leaped completely over an antagonist, cleaving his skull wide open with my longsword as I passed above him. I thought that I saw Thurid's eyes widen a bit during the narrative, and several times I surprised him gazing intently into my face through narrowed lids. Was he commencing to suspect? And then Kulan Tith told of the savage Kalat that fought beside me, and after that I saw suspicion in the eyes of Mata Shang, or did I but imagine it? At the close of the audience, Kulan Tith announced that he would have me accompany him upon the way to meet his royal guest, and as I departed with an officer who was to procure proper trappings and a suitable mount for me, both Mata Shang and Thurid seemed most sincere in professing their pleasure at having had an opportunity to know me. It was with a sigh of relief that I quitted the chamber, convinced that nothing more than a guilty conscience had prompted my belief that either of my enemies suspected my true identity. A half-hour later I rode out of the city gate with the column that accompanied Kulan Tith upon the way to meet his friend and ally. Though my eyes and ears had been wide open during my audience with the Jeddak and my various passages through the palace, I had seen or heard nothing of Dejah Thoris or Thuvia of Parth. That they must be somewhere within the great rambling edifice I was positive, and I should have given much to have found a way to remain behind during Kulan Tith's absence, that I might search for them. Toward noon we came in touch with the head of the columns we had set out to meet. It was a gorgeous train that accompanied the visiting Jeddak, and for miles it stretched along the wide white road to Kaul. Mounted troops, their trappings of jewel and metal-encrusted leather glistening in the sunlight, formed the vanguard of the body, and then came 1,000 gorgeous chariots drawn by huge zitadars. These low, commodious wagons moved two abreast, and on either side of them marched solid ranks of mounted warriors, for in the chariots were the women and children of the royal court. Upon the back of each monster zitadar rode a Martian youth, and the whole scene carried me back to my first days upon Barsoom, now 22 years in the past, when I had first beheld the gorgeous spectacle of a caravan of the green horde of Tharks. Never before today had I seen zitadars in the service of red men. These brutes are huge Macedonian animals that tower to an immense height even beside the giant green men and their giant thoats. But when compared to the relatively small red man and his breed of thoats, they assume Brobdingnagian proportions that are truly appalling. The beasts were hung with jeweled trappings and saddle pads of gay silk, embroidered in fanciful designs with strings of diamonds, pearls, rubies, emeralds, and the countless unnamed jewels of Mars, while from each chariot rose a dozen standards from which streamers, flags, and pennons fluttered in the breeze. Just in front of the chariots the visiting Jeddak rode alone upon a pure white thoat, another unusual sight upon Barsoom, and after them came interminable ranks of mounted spearmen, riflemen, and swordmen. It was indeed a most imposing sight. Except for the clanking of the accoutrements and the occasional squeal of an angry thoat or the low guttural of a zitadar, the passage of the cavalcade was almost noiseless, for neither thoat nor zitadar is a hoofed animal, and the broad tires of the chariots are of an elastic composition which gives forth no sound. Now and then the gay laughter of a woman or the chatter of children could be heard, for the Red Martians are a social, pleasure-loving people, in direct antithesis to the cold and morbid race of green men. The forms and ceremonials connected with the meeting of the two Jeddaks consumed an hour, and then we turned and retraced our way toward the city of Kaul, which the head of the column reached just before dark, though it must have been nearly morning before the rear guard passed through the gateway. Fortunately, I was well up toward the head of the column, and after the great banquet, which I attended with the officers of the royal guard, I was free to seek repose. There was so much activity and bustle about the palace all during the night, with the constant arrival of the noble officers of the visiting Jedic's retinue, that I dared not attempt to prosecute a search for Dejathoris, and so, as soon as it was seemly for me to do so, I returned to my quarters. As I passed along the corridors between the banquet hall and the apartments that had been allotted me, I had a sudden feeling that I was under surveillance, and turning quickly in my tracks caught a glimpse of a figure which darted into an open doorway the instant I wheeled about. Though I ran quickly back to the spot where the shadower had disappeared, I could find no trace of him. Yet in the brief glimpse that I had caught, I could have sworn that I had seen a white face surmounted by a mass of yellow hair. The incident gave me considerable food for speculation, since if I were right in the conclusion induced by the cursory glimpse I had had of the spy, then Mata Shang and Thuard must suspect my identity, and if that were true, not even the service I had rendered Kulan Tith could save me from his religious fanaticism. But never did vague conjecture or fruitless fears for the future lie with sufficient weight upon my mind to keep me from my rest, and so tonight I threw myself upon my sleeping silks and furs, and passed at once into dreamless slumber. Calots are not permitted within the walls of the palace proper, and so I had had to relegate poor Woola to quarters in the stables, where the royal thoats are kept. He had comfortable, even luxurious apartments, but I would have given much to have had him with me, and if he had been, the thing which happened that night would not have come to pass. I could not have slept over a quarter of an hour when I was suddenly awakened by the passing of some cold and clammy thing across my forehead. Instantly I sprang to my feet, clutching in the direction I thought the presence lay. For an instant my hand touched against human flesh, and then, as I lunged head foremost through the darkness to seize my nocturnal visitor, my foot became entangled in my sleeping silks, and I fell sprawling to the floor. By the time I had resumed my feet, and found the button which controlled the light, my color had disappeared. Careful search of the room revealed nothing to explain either the identity or business of the person who had thus secretly sought me in the dead of night. That the purpose might be theft I could not believe, since thieves are practically unknown upon Barsoom. Assassination, however, is rampant, but even this could not have been the motive of my stealthy friend, for he might easily have killed me had he desired. I had about given up fruitless conjecture and was on the point of returning to sleep when a dozen Kaulian guardsmen entered my apartment. The officer in charge was one of my genial hosts of the morning, but now upon his face was no sign of friendship. "Kulan Tith commands your presence before him," he said. "Come." End of chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 7. New Allies. Surrounded by guardsmen, I marched back along the corridors of the palace of Kulan Tith, Jeddak of Kaul, to the great audience chamber in the center of the massive structure. As I entered the brilliantly lighted apartment, filled with the nobles of Kaul and the officers of the visiting Jeddak, all eyes were turned upon me. Upon the great dais at the end of the chamber stood 3 thrones, upon which sat Kulan Tith and his 2 guests, Mata Shang and the visiting Jeddak. Up the broad center aisle we marched beneath deadly silence. At the foot of the thrones we halted. "Prefer thy charge," said Kulan Tith, turning to one who stood among the nobles at his right, and then Thuard, the black dator of the firstborn, stepped forward and faced me. "Most noble Jeddak," he said, addressing Kulan Tith, "from the first I suspected this stranger within thy palace. Your description of his fiendish prowess tallied with that of the arch-enemy of truth upon Barsoom. But that there might be no mistake, I dispatched a priest of your own holy cult to make the test that should pierce his disguise and reveal the truth. Behold the result." And Thurid pointed a rigid finger at my forehead. All eyes followed the direction of that accusing digit. I alone seemed at loss to guess what fatal sign rested upon my brow. The officer beside me guessed my perplexity, and as the brows of Kulantith darkened in a menacing scowl as his eyes rested upon me, the noble drew a small mirror from his pocket-pouch and held it before my face. One glance at the reflection it gave back to me was sufficient. From my forehead the hand of the sneaking Thurn had reached out through the concealing darkness of my bedchamber and wiped away a patch of the disguising red pigment as broad as my palm. Beneath showed the tan texture of my own white skin. For a moment Thurid ceased speaking to enhance, I suspect, the dramatic effect of his disclosure. Then he resumed. "Here, O Kulantith," he cried, "is he who has desecrated the temples of the gods of Mars, who has violated the persons of the holy Thurns themselves, and turned a world against its age-old religion. Before you, in your power, Jeddak of Kaul, defender of the holies, stands John Carter, Prince of Helium." Kulantith looked toward Mata Shang as though for corroboration of these charges. The holy Thurn nodded his head. "It is indeed the arch-blasphemer," he said. "Even now he has followed me to the very heart of thy palace, Kulantith, for the sole purpose of assassinating me. He lies!" I cried. "Kulantith, listen, that you may know the truth. Listen while I tell you why John Carter has followed Mata Shang to the heart of thy palace. Listen to me as well as to them, and then judge if my acts be not more in accord with true Barsoomian chivalry and honor than those of these revengeful devotees of the spurious creeds from whose cruel bonds I have freed your planet." "Silence!" roared the Jeddak, leaping to his feet and laying his hand upon the hilt of his sword. "Silence, blasphemer! Kulantith need not permit the air of his audience chamber to be defiled by the heresies that issue from your polluted throat to judge you. You stand already self-condemned. It but remains to determine the manner of your death. Even the service that you rendered the arms of Kaul shall avail you naught. It was but a base subterfuge whereby you might win your way into my favor and reach the side of this holy man whose life you craved. To the pits with him," he concluded, addressing the officer of my guard. Here was a pretty pass indeed. What chance had I against a whole nation? What hope for me of mercy at the hands of the fanatical Kulantith with such advisers as Mata Shang and Thurid? The black grinned malevolently in my face. "You shall not escape this time, Earthman," he taunted. The guards closed toward me. A red haze blurred my vision. The fighting blood of my Virginian sires coursed hot through my veins. The lust of battle in all its mad fury was upon me. With a leap I was beside Thurid, and ere the devilish smirk had faded from his handsome face, I had caught him full upon the mouth with my clenched fist, and as the good old American blow landed, the black dator shot back a dozen feet, to crumple in a heap at the foot of Kulantith's throne, spitting blood and teeth from his hurt mouth. Then I drew my sword and swung round, on guard to face a nation. In an instant the guardsmen were upon me, but before a blow had been struck a mighty voice rose above the din of shouting warriors, and a giant figure leaped from the dais beside Kulantith, and with drawn longsword threw himself between me and my adversaries. It was the visiting Jeddak. "Hold!" he cried. "If you value my friendship, Kulantith, and the age-old peace that has existed between our peoples, call off your swordsmen. For wherever or against whomsoever fights John Carter, Prince of Helium, there beside him and to the death fights Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Parth." The shouting ceased, and the menacing points were lowered as 1,000 eyes turned first toward Thuvan Din in surprise, and then toward Kulantith in question. At first the Jeddak of Kaul went white in rage, but before he spoke he had mastered himself, so that his tone was calm and even as befitted intercourse between two great Jeddaks. "Thuvan Din," he said slowly, "must have great provocation thus to desecrate the ancient customs which inspire the deportment of a guest within the palace of his host. Lest I, too, should forget myself as has my royal friend, I should prefer to remain silent until the Jeddak of Parth has won from me applause for his action by relating the causes which provoked it." I could see that the Jeddak of Parth was of half mind to throw his metal in Kulantith's face, but he controlled himself even as well as had his host. "None knows better than Thuvan Din," he said, "the laws which govern the acts of men in the domains of their neighbors. But Thuvan Din owes allegiance to a higher law than these, the law of gratitude. Nor to any man upon Barsoom does he owe a greater debt of gratitude than to John Carter, Prince of Helium. Years ago, Kulantith," he continued, "upon the occasion of your last visit to me, you were greatly taken with the charms and graces of my only daughter, Thuvia. You saw how I adored her, and later you learned that, inspired by some unfathomable whim, she had taken the last long voluntary pilgrimage upon the cold bosom of the mysterious Ish, leaving me desolate. Some months ago I first heard of the expedition which John Carter had led against Ishis and the Holy Therns. Faint rumors of the atrocities reported to have been committed by the Therns upon those who for countless ages have floated down the mighty Ish came to my ears. I heard that thousands of prisoners had been released, few of whom dared to return to their own countries, owing to the mandate of terrible death which rests against all who return from the Valley Door. For a time I could not believe the heresies which I heard, and I prayed that my daughter Thuvia might have died before she ever committed the sacrilege of returning to the outer world. But then my father's love asserted itself, and I vowed that I would prefer eternal damnation to further separation from her if she could be found. So I sent emissaries to Helium, and to the court of Exodar, Jeddak of the Firstborn, and to him who now rules those of the Thern nation that have renounced their religion, and from each and all I heard the same story of unspeakable cruelties and atrocities perpetuated upon the poor defenseless victims of their religion by the Holy Therns. Many there were who had seen or known my daughter, and from Therns who had been close to Mata Shang I learned of the indignities that he personally heaped upon her, and I was glad when I came here to find that Mata Shang was also your guest, for I should have sought him out had it taken a lifetime. More too I heard, and that of the chivalrous kindness that John Carter had accorded my daughter. They told me how he fought for her and rescued her, and how he spurned escape from the savage war-hoons of the south, sending her to safety upon his own thoat, and remaining upon foot to meet the green warriors. Can you wonder, Kulantith, that I am willing to jeopardize my life, the peace of my nation, or even your friendship, which I prize more than aught else, to champion the Prince of Helium?" For a moment Kulantith was silent. I could see by the expression of his face that he was sore perplexed. Then he spoke. "Thuvan Din," he said, and his tone was friendly, though sad. "Who am I to judge my fellow man? In my eyes the Father of Therns is still holy, and the religion which he teaches the only true religion. But were I faced by the same problem that has vexed you, I doubt not that I should feel and act precisely as you have. In so far as the Prince of Helium is concerned, I may act, but between you and Mata Shang my only office can be one of conciliation. The Prince of Helium shall be escorted in safety to the boundary of my domain ere the sun has set again, where he shall be free to go whither he will, but upon pain of death must he never again enter the land of Kaul. If there be a quarrel between you and the Father of Therns, I need not ask that the settlement of it be deferred until both have passed beyond the limits of my power. Are you satisfied, Thuvan Din?" The Jeddak of Parth nodded his assent, but the ugly scowl that he bent upon Mata Shang harbored ill for that pasty-faced godling. "The Prince of Helium is far from satisfied," I cried, breaking rudely in upon the beginnings of peace, for I had no stomach for peace at the price that had been named. I have escaped death in a dozen forms to follow Mata Shang and overtake him, and I do not intend to be led like a decrepit thoat to the slaughter, from the goal that I have won by the prowess of my sword arm and the might of my muscles. Nor will Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Parth, be satisfied when he has heard me through. Do you know why I have followed Mata Shang and Thurid the Black Dator from the forest of the Valley Door across half a world through almost insurmountable difficulties? Think you that John Carter, Prince of Helium, would stoop to assassination? Can Kulantith be such a fool as to believe that lie whispered in his ear by the Holy Thern or Dator Thurid? I do not follow Mata Shang to kill him, though the god of mine own planet knows that my hands itch to be at his throat. I follow him, Thuvan Din, because with him are two prisoners, my wife, Deja Thors, Princess of Helium, and your daughter, Thuvia of Parth.
Now think you that I shall permit myself to be led beyond the walls of Kaul unless the mother of my son accompanies me, and thy daughter be restored?" Thuvan Din turned upon Kulan Tith. Rage flamed in his keen eyes, but by the masterfulness of his self-control he kept his tones level as he spoke. "Knew you this thing, Kulan Tith?" he asked. "Knew you that my daughter lay a prisoner in your palace?" "He could not know it," interrupted Mata Shang, white with what I am sure was more fear than rage. "He could not know it, for it is a lie. I would have had his life for that upon the spot, but even as I sprang toward him, Thuvan Din laid a heavy hand upon my shoulder. "Wait," he said to me, and then to Kulan Tith, "It is not a lie. This much have I learned of the Prince of Helium. He does not lie. Answer me, Kulan Tith. I have asked you a question." "3 women came with the father of Therns," replied Kulan Tith, "Feodor his daughter, and 2 who were reported to be her slaves. If these be Thuvia of Parth and Deja Thors of Helium, I did not know it. I have seen neither. But if they be, then shall they be returned to you on the morrow." As he spoke he looked straight at Mata Shang, not as a devotee should look at a high priest, but as a ruler of men looks at one to whom he issues a command. It must have been plain to the father of Therns, as it was to me, that the recent disclosures of his true character had done much already to weaken the faith of Kulan Tith, and that it would require but little more to turn the powerful Jeddak into an avowed enemy. But so strong are the seeds of superstition that even the great Kaulian still hesitated to cut the final strand that bound him to his ancient religion. Mata Shang was wise enough to seem to accept the mandate of his follower, and promised to bring the 2 slave women to the audience chamber on the morrow. "It is almost morning now," he said, "and I should dislike to break in upon the slumber of my daughter, or I would have them fetched at once that you might see that the Prince of Helium is mistaken." And he emphasized the last word in an effort to affront me so subtly that I could not take open offense. I was about to object to any delay, and demand that the Princess of Helium be brought to me forthwith, when Thuvan Din made such insistence seem unnecessary. "I should like to see my daughter at once," he said, "but if Kulan Tith will give me his assurance that none will be permitted to leave the palace this night, and that no harm shall befall either Deja Thors or Thuvia of Parth between now and the moment they are brought into our presence in this chamber at daylight, I shall not insist." "None shall leave the palace tonight," replied the Jeddak of Kaul, "and Mata Shang will give us assurance that no harm will come to the 2 women." The Thurn assented with a nod. A few moments later Kulan Tith indicated that the audience was at an end, and at Thuvan Din's invitation I accompanied the Jeddak of Parth to his own apartments, where we sat until daylight, while he listened to the account of my experiences upon his planet and to all that had befallen his daughter during the time that we had been together. I found the father of Thuvia a man after my own heart, and that night saw the beginning of a friendship which has grown until it is second only to that which obtains between Tars Tarkas, the Green Jeddak of Thark, and myself. The first burst of Mars's sudden dawn brought messengers from Kulan Tith, summoning us to the audience chamber where Thuvan Din was to receive his daughter after years of separation, and I was to be reunited with the glorious daughter of Helium after almost an unbroken separation of 12 years. My heart pounded within my bosom until I looked about me in embarrassment. So sure was I that all within the room must hear. My arms ached to enfold once more the divine form of her whose eternal youth and undying beauty were but outward manifestations of a perfect soul. At last the messenger dispatched to fetch Mata Shang returned. I craned my neck to catch the first glimpse of those who should be following, but the messenger was alone. Halting before the throne, he addressed his Jeddak in a voice that was plainly audible to all within the chamber. "O Kulan Tith, mightiest of Jeddaks," he cried, after the fashion of the court, "your messenger returns alone, for when he reached the apartments of the father of Therns, he found them empty, as were those occupied by his suite." Kulan Tith went white. A low groan burst from the lips of Thuvan Din, who stood next to me, not having ascended the throne which awaited him beside his host. For a moment the silence of death reigned in the great audience chamber of Kulan Tith, Jeddak of Kaul. It was he who broke the spell. Rising from his throne, he stepped down from the dais to the side of Thuvan Din. Tears dimmed his eyes as he placed both his hands upon the shoulders of his friend. "O Thuvan Din," he cried, "that this should have happened in the palace of thy best friend! With my own hands would I have wrung the neck of Mata Shang had I guessed what was in his foul heart. Last night my lifelong faith was weakened. This morning it has been shattered. But too late, too late. To wrest your daughter and the wife of this royal warrior from the clutches of these arch-fiends, you have but to command the resources of a mighty nation. For all Kaul is at your disposal. What may be done? Say the word." "First," I suggested, "let us find those of your people who be responsible for the escape of Mata Shang and his followers. Without assistance on the part of the palace guard this thing could not have come to pass. Seek the guilty, and from them force an explanation of the manner of their going and the direction they have taken." Before Kulantith could issue the commands that would initiate the investigation, a handsome young officer stepped forward and addressed his Jeddak. "O Kulantith, mightiest of Jeddaks," he said, "I alone be responsible for this grievous error. Last night it was I who commanded the palace guard. I was on duty in other parts of the palace during the audience of the early morning, and knew nothing of what transpired then, so that when the father of Thurm summoned me and explained that it was your wish that his party be hastened from the city because of the presence here of a deadly enemy who sought the holy Hecador's life, I did only what a lifetime of training has taught me was the proper thing to do. I obeyed him whom I believed to be the ruler of us all, mightier even than thou, mightiest of Jeddaks. Let the consequences and the punishment fall on me alone, for I alone am guilty. Those others of the palace guard who assisted in the flight did so under my instructions." Kulantith looked first at me and then at Thuvan Din, as though to ask our judgment upon the man, but the air was so evidently excusable that neither of us had any mind to see the young officer suffer for a mistake that any might readily have made. "How left they?" asked Thuvan Din, "and what direction did they take?" "They left as they came," replied the officer, "upon their own flyer. For some time after they had departed I watched the vessel's lights, which vanished finally due north." "Where north could Mata Shang find an asylum?" asked Thuvan Din of Kulantith. For some moments the Jeddak of Kaul stood with bowed head, apparently deep in thought. Then a sudden light brightened his countenance. "I have it!" he cried. "Only yesterday Mata Shang let drop a hint of his destination, telling me of a race of people unlike ourselves who dwell far to the north. They, he said, had always been known to the holy Therns and were devout and faithful followers of the ancient cult. Among them would he find a perpetual haven of refuge, where no lying heretics might seek him out. It is there that Mata Shang has gone." "And in all Kaul there be no flyer wherein to follow," I cried. "No nearer than Parth," replied Thuvan Din. "Wait!" I exclaimed. "Beyond the southern fringe of this great forest lies the wreck of the Thurn flyer which brought me that far upon my way. If you will loan me men to fetch it, and artificers to assist me, I can repair it in 2 days, Kulantith." I had been more than half suspicious of the seeming sincerity of the Kaulian Jeddak's sudden apostasy, but the alacrity with which he embraced my suggestion, and the dispatch with which a force of officers and men were placed at my disposal entirely removed the last vestige of my doubts. 2 days later the flyer rested upon the top of the watchtower, ready to depart. Thuvan Din and Kulantith had offered me the entire resources of 2 nations. Millions of fighting men were at my disposal, but my flyer could hold but one other than myself and Wula. As I stepped aboard her, Thuvan Din took his place beside me. I cast a look of questioning surprise upon him. He turned to the highest of his own officers who had accompanied him to Kaul. "To you I entrust the return of my retinue to Parth," he said. "There my son rules ably in my absence. The Prince of Helium shall not go alone into the land of his enemies. I have spoken. Farewell." End of Chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 8. Through the Carrion Caves. Straight toward the north, day and night, our destination compass led us after the fleeing flyer upon which it had remained set since I first attuned it after leaving the Thurn fortress. Early in the second night we noticed the air becoming perceptibly colder, and from the distance we had come from the equator were assured that we were rapidly approaching the North Arctic region. My knowledge of the efforts that had been made by countless expeditions to explore that unknown land bade me to caution, for never had flyer returned who had passed to any considerable distance beyond the mighty ice barrier that fringes the southern hem of the frigid zone. What became of them none knew, only that they passed forever out of the sight of men into that grim and mysterious country of the pole. The distance from the barrier to the pole was no more than a swift flyer should cover in a few hours, and so it was assumed that some frightful catastrophe awaited those who reached the forbidden land, as it had come to be called by the Martians of the outer world. Thus it was that I went more slowly as we approached the barrier, for it was my intention to move cautiously by day over the ice pack that I might discover, before I had run into a trap, if there really lay an inhabited country at the North Pole, for there only could I imagine a spot where Mata Shang might feel secure from John Carter, Prince of Helium. We were flying at a snail's pace but a few feet above the ground, literally feeling our way along through the darkness, for both moons had set, and the night was black with the clouds that are to be found only at Mars's two extremities. Suddenly a towering wall of white rose directly in our path, and though I threw the helm hard over and reversed our engines, I was too late to avoid collision. With a sickening crash we struck the high-looming obstacle 3/4 on. The flyer reeled half over, the engine stopped. As one, the patched buoyancy tanks burst, and we plunged, head foremost, to the ground 20 feet beneath. Fortunately, none of us was injured, and when we had disentangled ourselves from the wreckage, and the lesser moon had burst again from below the horizon, we found that we were at the foot of a mighty ice barrier, from which outcropped great patches of the granite hills which hold it from encroaching further toward the south. What fate, with the journey all but completed, to be thus wrecked upon the wrong side of that precipice, an unscalable wall of rock and ice! I looked at Thuvan Din. He but shook his head dejectedly. The balance of the night we spent shivering in our inadequate sleeping silks and furs upon the snow that lays at the foot of the ice barrier. With daylight my battered spirits regained something of their accustomed hopefulness, though I must admit that there was little enough for them to feed upon. "What shall we do?" asked Thuvan Din. "How may we pass that which is impassable?" "First we must disprove its impassability," I replied. "Nor shall I admit that it is impassable before I have followed its entire circle and stand again upon this spot defeated. The sooner we start, the better, for I see no other way, and it will take us more than a month to travel the weary, frigid miles that lay before us." For 5 days of cold and suffering and privation we traversed the rough and frozen way which lays at the foot of the ice barrier. Fierce fur-bearing creatures attacked us by daylight and by dark. Never for a moment were we safe from the sudden charge of some huge demon of the north. The Apt was our most consistent and dangerous foe. It is a huge white-furred creature with 6 limbs, 4 of which, short and heavy, carry it swiftly over the snow and ice, while the other 2, growing forward from its shoulders on either side of its long, powerful neck, terminate in white, hairless hands, with which it seizes and holds its prey. Its head and mouth are more similar in appearance to those of a hippopotamus than to any other earthly animal, except that from the sides of the lower jawbone 2 mighty horns curve slightly downward toward the front. Its 2 huge eyes inspired my greatest curiosity. They extend in 2 vast oval patches from the center of the top of the cranium down either side of the head to below the roots of the horns, so that these weapons really grow out from the lower part of the eyes, which are composed of several thousand ocelli each. This eye structure seemed remarkable in a beast whose haunts were upon a glaring field of ice and snow, and though I found upon minute examination of several that we killed that each ocellus is furnished with its own lid, and that the animal can at will close as many of the facets of his huge eyes as he chooses, yet I was positive that nature had thus equipped him because much of his life was to be spent in dark, subterranean recesses.
Shortly after this we came upon the hugest ape that we had seen. The creature stood fully 8 feet at the shoulder, and was so sleek and clean and glossy that I could have sworn that he had but recently been groomed. He stood head-on, eyeing us as we approached him, for we had found it a waste of time to attempt to escape the perpetual bestial rage which seems to possess these demon creatures, who rove the dismal north, attacking every living thing that comes within the scope of their far-seeing eyes. Even when their bellies are full and they can eat no more, they kill purely for the pleasure which they derive from taking life. And so when this particular ape failed to charge us, and instead wheeled and trotted away as we neared him, I should have been greatly surprised had I not chanced to glimpse the sheen of a golden collar about its neck. Thuvan Din saw it too, and it carried the same message of hope to us both. Only man could have placed that collar there, and as no race of Martians of which we knew ought ever have attempted to domesticate the ferocious ape, he must belong to a people of the north of whose very existence we were ignorant, possibly to the fabled Yellowmen of Barsoom, that once powerful race which was supposed to be extinct, though sometimes, by theorists, thought still to exist in the frozen north. Simultaneously we started upon the trail of the great beast. Woola was quickly made to understand our desires, so that it was unnecessary to attempt to keep in sight of the animal, whose swift flight over the rough ground soon put him beyond our vision. For the better part of 2 hours the trail paralleled the barrier, and then suddenly turned toward it through the roughest and seemingly most impassable country I had ever beheld. Enormous granite boulders blocked the way on every hand. Deep rifts in the ice threatened to engulf us at the least misstep, and from the north a slight breeze wafted to our nostrils an unspeakable stench that almost choked us. For another 2 hours we were occupied in traversing a few hundred yards to the foot of the barrier. Then, turning about the corner of a wall-like outcropping of granite, we came upon a smooth area of 2 or 3 acres before the base of the towering pile of ice and rock that had baffled us for days, and before us beheld the dark and cavernous mouth of a cave. From this repelling portal the horrid stench was emanating, and as Thuvan Din espied the place he halted with an exclamation of profound astonishment. "By all my ancestors," he ejaculated, "that I should have lived to witness the reality of the fabled Carrion Caves! If these indeed be they, we have found a way beyond the ice barrier." The ancient chronicles of the first historians of Barsoom, so ancient that we have for ages considered them mythology, record the passing of the Yellowmen from the ravages of the green hordes that overran Barsoom as the drying up of the great oceans drove the dominant races from their strongholds. They tell of the wanderings of the remnant of this once powerful race, harassed at every step until at last they found a way through the ice barrier of the north to a fertile valley at the pole. At the opening to the subterranean passage that led to their haven of refuge, a mighty battle was fought in which the Yellowmen were victorious, and within the caves that gave ingress to their new home they piled the bodies of the dead, both yellow and green, that the stench might warn away their enemies from further pursuit. And ever since that long-gone day have the dead of this fabled land been carried to the Carrion Caves, that in death and decay they might serve their country and warn away invading enemies. Here too is brought, so the fable runs, all the waste stuff of the nation, everything that is subject to rot, and that can add to the foul stench that assails our nostrils. And death lurks at every step among rotting dead, for here the fierce apes lair, adding to the putrid accumulation with the fragments of their own prey which they cannot devour. It is a horrid avenue to our goal, but it is the only one. "You are sure, then, that we have found the way to the land of the Yellowmen?" I cried. "As sure as may be," he replied, "having only ancient legend to support my belief. But see how closely, so far, each detail tallies with the world-old story of the Hijra of the Yellow race. Yes, I am sure that we have discovered the way to their ancient hiding-place." "If it be true, and let us pray that such may be the case," I said, "then here may we solve the mystery of the disappearance of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium, and Mors Kajak his son, for no other spot upon Barsoom has remained unexplored by the many expeditions and the countless spies that have been searching for them for nearly 2 years. The last word that came from them was that they sought Carthoris, my own brave son, beyond the ice barrier. As we talked we had been approaching the entrance to the cave, and as we crossed the threshold I ceased to wonder that the ancient green enemies of the yellow men had been halted by the horrors of that awful way. The bones of dead men lay man high upon the broad floor of the first cave, and over all was a putrid mush of decaying flesh, through which the apes had beaten a hideous trail toward the entrance to the second cave beyond. The roof of this first apartment was low, like all that we traversed subsequently, so that the foul odors were confined and condensed to such an extent that they seemed to possess tangible substance. One was almost tempted to draw his short sword and hew his way through in search of pure air beyond. "Can man breathe this polluted air and live?" asked Thuvandin, choking. "Not for long, I imagine," I replied. "So let us make haste. I will go first, and you bring up the rear, with Woola between. Come," and with the words I dashed forward across the fetid mass of putrefaction. It was not until we had passed through 7 caves of different sizes, and varying but little in the power and quality of their stenches, that we met with any physical opposition. Then, within the 8th cave, we came upon a lair of apes. A full score of the mighty beasts were disposed about the chamber. Some were sleeping, while others tore at the flesh-killed carcasses of new-brought prey, or fought among themselves in their love-making. Here, in the dim light of their subterranean home, the value of their great eyes was apparent, for these inner caves are shrouded in perpetual gloom that is but little less than utter darkness. To attempt to pass through the midst of that fierce herd seemed even to me the height of folly, and so I proposed to Thuvandin that he return to the outer world with Woola, that the two might find their way to the civilization and come again with a sufficient force to overcome not only the apes, but any further obstacles that might lay between us and our goal. In the meantime, I continued, I may discover some means of winning my way alone to the land of the yellow men. But if I am unsuccessful, 1 life only will have been sacrificed. Should we all go on and perish, there will be none to guide a succoring party to Dejah Thoris and your daughter. I shall not return and leave you here alone, John Carter, replied Thuvandin. Whether you go on to victory or death, the Jeddak of Parth remains at your side. I have spoken. I knew from his tone that it were useless to attempt to argue the question, and so I compromised by sending Woola back with a hastily penned note enclosed in a small metal case and fastened about his neck. I commanded the faithful creature to seek Carthoris at Helium, and though half a world and countless dangers lay between, I knew that if the thing could be done, Woola would do it. Equipped as he was by nature with marvelous speed and endurance, and with frightful ferocity that made him a match for any single enemy of the way, his keen intelligence and wondrous instinct should easily furnish all else that was needed for the successful accomplishment of his mission. It was with evident reluctance that the great beast turned to leave me in compliance with my command, and ere he had gone I could not resist the inclination to throw my arms about his great neck in a parting hug. He rubbed his cheek against mine in a final caress, and a moment later was speeding through the carrion caves toward the outer world. In my note to Carthoris I had given explicit directions for locating the carrion caves, impressing upon him the necessity for making entrance to the country beyond through this avenue, and not to attempt under any circumstances to cross the ice barrier with a fleet. I told him that what lay beyond the 8th cave I could not even guess, but I was sure that somewhere upon the other side of the ice barrier his mother lay in the power of Mata Shang, and that possibly his grandfather and great-grandfather as well, if they lived. Further, I advised him to call upon Kulan Tith and the son of Thuvandin for warriors and ships, that the expedition might be sufficiently strong to ensure success at the first blow. And, I concluded, if there be time, bring Tars Tarkas with you, for if I live until you reach me I can think of few greater pleasures than to fight once more shoulder to shoulder with my old friend. When Woola had left us, Thuvandin and I, hiding in the 7th cave, discussed and discarded many plans for crossing the 8th chamber. From where we stood we saw that the fighting among the apes was growing less, and the many that had been feeding had ceased and lain down to sleep. Presently it became apparent that in a short time all the ferocious monsters might be peacefully slumbering, and thus a hazardous opportunity be presented to us to cross through their lair. One by one the remaining brutes stretched themselves upon the bubbling decomposition that covered the mass of bones upon the floor of their den, until but a single ape remained awake. This huge fellow roamed restlessly about, nosing among his companion and the abhorrent litter of the cave. Occasionally he would stop to peer intently toward first one of the exits from the chamber and then the other. His whole demeanor was as of one who acts as a sentry. We were at last forced to the belief that he would not sleep while the other occupants of the lair slept, and so cast about in our minds for some scheme whereby we might trick him. Finally I suggested a plan to Thuvandin, and as it seemed as good as any that we had discussed, we decided to put it to the test. To this end Thuvandin placed himself close against the cave's wall, beside the entrance to the 8th chamber, while I deliberately showed myself to the guardian ape as he looked toward our retreat. Then I sprang to the opposite side of the entrance, flattening my body close to the wall. Without a sound the great beast moved rapidly toward the 7th cave to see what manner of intruder had thus rashly penetrated so far within the precincts of his habitation. As he poked his head through the narrow aperture that connects the 2 caves, a heavy longsword was awaiting him upon either hand, and before he had an opportunity to emit even a single growl, his severed head rolled at our feet. Quickly we glanced into the 8th chamber. Not an ape had moved. Crawling over the carcass of the huge beast that blocked the doorway, Thuvandin and I cautiously entered the forbidding and dangerous den. Like snails we wound our silent and careful way among the huge recumbent forms. The only sound above our breathing was the sucking noise of our feet as we lifted them from the ooze of decaying flesh through which we crept. Halfway across the chamber, and one of the mighty beasts directly before me moved restlessly at the very instant that my foot was poised above his head, over which I must step. Breathlessly I waited, balancing upon one foot, for I did not dare move a muscle. In my right hand was my keen short-sword, the point hovering an inch above the thick fur beneath which beat the savage heart. Finally the ape relaxed, sighing, as with the passing of a bad dream, and resumed the regular respiration of deep slumber. I planted my raised foot beyond the fierce head, and an instant later had stepped over the beast. Thuvandin followed directly after me, and another moment found us at the further door undetected. The carrion caves consist of a series of 27 connecting chambers, and present the appearance of having been eroded by running water in some far-gone age, when a mighty river found its way to the south through this single breach in the barrier of rock and ice that hems the country of the pole. Thuvandin and I traversed the remaining 19 caverns without adventure or mishap. We were afterward to learn that but once a month it is possible to find all the apes of the carrion caves in a single chamber. At other times they roam singly or in pairs in and out of the caves, so that it would have been practically impossible for 2 men to have passed through the entire 27 chambers without encountering an ape in nearly every one of them. Once a month they sleep for a full day, and it was our good fortune to stumble by accident upon one of these occasions. Beyond the last cave we emerged into a desolate country of snow and ice, but found a well-marked trail leading north. The way was boulder-strewn, as had been that south of the barrier, so that we could see but a short distance ahead of us at any time. After a couple of hours we passed round a huge boulder to come to a steep declivity leading down into a valley. Directly before us we saw a half-dozen men, fierce black-bearded fellows with skin the color of a ripe lemon. "The yellow men of Barsoom," ejaculated Thuvandin, as though even now that he saw them he found it scarce possible to believe that the very race we expected to find hidden in this remote and inaccessible land did really exist. We withdrew behind an adjacent boulder to watch the actions of the little party, which stood huddled at the foot of another huge rock, their backs toward us. One of them was peering round the edge of the granite mass as though watching one who approached from the opposite side. Presently the object of his scrutiny came within the range of my vision, and I saw that it was another yellow man. All were clothed in magnificent furs, the 6 in the black and yellow striped hide of the Orluk, while he who approached alone was resplendent in the pure white skin of an ape. The yellow men were armed with 2 swords, and a short javelin was slung across the back of each. while from their left arms hung cup-like shields no larger than a dinner plate, the concave sides of which turned outward toward an antagonist. They seemed puny and futile implements of safety against even ordinary swordsmen, but I was later to see the purpose of them, and with what wondrous dexterity the yellow men manipulated them. One of the swords which each of the warriors carried caught my immediate attention. I call it a sword, but really it was a sharp-edged blade with a complete hook at the far end. The other sword was of about the same length as the hooked instrument, and somewhere between that of my long sword and my short sword. It was straight and two-edged. In addition to the weapons I have enumerated, each man carried a dagger in his harness. As the white-furred one approached, the 6 grasped their swords more firmly, the hooked instrument in the left hand, the straight sword in the right, while above the left wrist the small shield was held rigid upon a metal bracelet. As the lone warrior came opposite them, the 6 rushed out upon him with fiendish yells that resembled nothing more closely than the savage war-cry of the Apaches of the Southwest. Instantly the attacked drew both his swords, and as the 6 fell upon him I witnessed as pretty fighting as one might care to see. With their sharp hooks the combatants attempted to take hold of an adversary, but like lightning the cup-shaped shield would spring before the darting weapon, and into its hollow the hook would plunge. Once the lone warrior caught an antagonist in the side with his hook, and drawing him close, ran his sword through him. But the odds were too unequal, and though he who fought alone was by far the best and bravest of them all, I saw that it was but a question of time before the remaining 5 would find an opening through his marvelous guard and bring him down. Now my sympathies have ever been with the weaker side of an argument, and though I knew nothing of the cause of the trouble, I could not stand idly by and see a brave man butchered by superior numbers. As a matter of fact, I presume I gave little attention to seeking an excuse, for I love a good fight too well to need any other reason for joining in when one is afoot. So it was that before Thuvan Din knew what I was about, he saw me, standing by the side of the white-clad yellow man, battling like mad with his 5 adversaries. End of Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 9. With the Yellow Men. Thuvan Din was not long in joining me, and though we found the hooked weapon a strange and savage thing with which to deal, the 3 of us soon dispatched the 5 black-bearded warriors who opposed us. When the battle was over, our new acquaintance turned to me, and removing the shield from his wrist, held it out. I did not know the significance of his act, but judged that it was but a form of expressing his gratitude to me. I afterward learned that it symbolized the offering of a man's life in return for some great favor done him, and my act of refusing, which I had immediately done, was what was expected of me. Then accept from Taulu, Prince of Marantina, said the yellow man, this token of my gratitude, and reaching beneath one of his wide sleeves he withdrew a bracelet, and placed it upon my arm. He then went through the same ceremony with Thuvan Din. Next he asked our names, and from what land we hailed. He seemed quite familiar with the geography of the outer world, and when I said I was from Helium he raised his eyebrows. "Ah," he said, "you seek your ruler and his company." "Know you of them?" I asked. "But little more than that they were captured by my uncle, Salensis Ol, Jeddak of Jeddaks, ruler of Okar, land of the yellow men of Barsoom. As to their fate I know nothing, for I am at war with my uncle, who would crush my power in the principality of Marantina. These from whom you have just saved me are warriors he has sent out to find and slay me, for they know that often I come alone to hunt and kill the sacred ape which Salensis Ol so much reveres. It is partly because I hate his religion that Salensis Ol hates me, but mostly does he fear my growing power and the great faction which has arisen throughout Okar that would be glad to see me ruler of Okar and Jeddak of Jeddaks in his place. He is a cruel and tyrannous master whom all hate,
and were it not for the great fear they have of him, I could raise an army overnight that would wipe out the few that might remain loyal to him. My own people are faithful to me, and the little valley of Marantina has paid no tribute to the court of Salensis Ol for a year. Nor can he force us, for a dozen men may hold the narrow way to Marantina against 1,000,000. But now as to thine own affairs, how may I aid you? My palace is at your disposal, if you wish to honor me by coming to Marantina." "When our work is done we shall be glad to accept your invitation," I replied. "But now you can assist us most by directing us to the court of Salensis Ol and suggesting some means by which we may gain admission to the city and the palace, or whatever other place we find our friends to be confined." Taulul gazed ruefully at our smooth faces and at Thuvandin's red skin and my white one. "First you must come to Marantina," he said, "for a great change must be wrought in your appearance before you can hope to enter any city in Okar. You must have yellow faces and black beards, and your apparel and trappings must be those least likely to arouse suspicion. In my palace is one who can make you appear as truly yellow men as does Salensis Ol himself." His counsel seemed wise, and as there was apparently no other way to ensure a successful entry to Cadabra, the capital city of Okar, we set out with Taulul, Prince of Marantina, for his little rock-bound country. The way was over some of the worst travelling I have ever seen, and I do not wonder that in this land where there are neither thoats nor flyers that Marantina is in little fear of invasion. But at last we reached our destination, the first view of which I had from a slight elevation a half-mile from the city. Nestled in a deep valley lay a city of Martian concrete, whose every street and plaza and open space was roofed with glass. All about lay snow and ice, but there was none upon the rounded, dome-like crystal covering that enveloped the whole city. Then I saw how these people combated the rigors of the Arctic, and lived in luxury and comfort in the midst of a land of perpetual ice. Their cities were veritable hothouses, and when I had come within this one, my respect and admiration for the scientific and engineering skill of this buried nation was unbounded. The moment we entered the city, Taulul threw off his outer garments of fur, as did we, and I saw that his apparel differed but little from that of the red races of Barsoom. Except for his leathern harness, covered thick with jewels and metal, he was naked, nor could one have comfortably worn apparel in that warm and humid atmosphere. For 3 days we remained the guests of Prince Taulul. During that time he showered upon us every attention and courtesy within his power. He showed us all that was of interest in his great city. The Marantina atmosphere plant will maintain life indefinitely in the cities of the North Pole after all life upon the balance of dying Mars is extinct through the failure of the air supply. Should the great central plant again cease functioning as it did upon that memorable occasion that gave me the opportunity of restoring life and happiness to the strange world that I had already learned to love so well. He showed us the heating system that stores the sun's rays in great reservoirs beneath the city, and how little is necessary to maintain the perpetual summer heat of the glorious garden spot within this Arctic paradise. Broad avenues of sod sown with the seed of the ochre vegetation of the Dead Sea bottoms carried the noiseless traffic of light and airy ground flyers that are the only form of artificial transportation used north of the gigantic ice barrier. The broad tires of these unique flyers are but rubber-like gas bags filled with the 8th Barsoomium ray, or ray of propulsion, that remarkable discovery of the Martians that has made possible the great fleets of mighty airships that render the red men of the outer world supreme. It is this ray which propels the inherent or reflected light of the planet off into space, and when confined gives to the Martian craft their airy buoyancy. The ground flyers of Marantina contain just sufficient buoyancy in their automobile-like wheels to give the cars traction for steering purposes, and though the hind wheels are geared to the engine and aid in driving the machine, the bulk of this work is carried by a small propeller at the stern. I know of no more delightful sensation than that of riding in one of these luxuriously appointed cars which skim, light and airy as feathers, along the soft, mossy avenues of Marantina. They move with absolute noiselessness, between borders of crimson sward and beneath arching trees gorgeous with the wondrous blooms that mark so many of the highly cultivated varieties of Barsoomian vegetation. By the end of the third day, the court barber, I can think of no other earthly appellation by which to describe him, had wrought so remarkable a transformation in both Thuvan Din and myself that our own wives would never have known us. Our skins were of the same lemon color as his own, and great black beards and mustaches had been deftly affixed to our smooth faces. The trappings of warriors of Okar aided in the deception, and for where beyond the hothouse cities we each had suits of black and yellow striped orlik. Taulul gave us careful directions for the journey to Cadabra, the capital city of the Okar nation, which is the racial name of the Yellow Men. This good friend even accompanied us part way, and then, promising to aid us in any way that he found possible, bade us adieu. On parting he slipped upon my finger a curiously wrought ring set with a dead black, lustreless stone which appeared more like a bit of bituminous coal than the priceless Barsoomian gem which in reality it is. There had been but 3 others cut from the mother stone, he said, which is in my possession. These 3 are worn by nobles high in my confidence, all of whom have been sent on secret missions to the court of Salensis Ol. Should you come within 50 feet of any of these 3, you will feel a rapid pricking sensation in the finger upon which you wear this ring. He who wears one of its mates will experience the same feeling. It is caused by an electrical action that takes place the moment 2 of these gems cut from the same mother stone come within the radius of each other's power. By it you will know that a friend is at hand upon whom you may depend for assistance in time of need. Should another wearer of one of these gems call upon you for aid, do not deny him, and should death threaten you, swallow the ring rather than let it fall into the hands of enemies. Guard it with your life, John Carter, for some day it may mean more than life to you. With this parting admonition our good friend turned back toward Marantina, and we set our faces in the direction of the city of Cadabra and the court of Salensis Ol, Jeddak of Jeddaks. That very evening we came within sight of the walled and glass-roofed city of Cadabra. It lies in a low depression near the pole, surrounded by rocky snow-clad hills. From the pass through which we entered the valley, we had a splendid view of this great city of the north. Its crystal dome sparkled in the brilliant sunlight, gleaming above the frost-covered outer wall that circles the entire 100 miles of its circumference. At regular intervals great gates give entrance to the city, but even at the distance from which we looked upon the massive pile, we could see that all were closed, and in accordance with Taulul's suggestion we deferred attempting to enter the city until the following morning. As he had said, we found numerous caves in the hillsides about us, and into one of these we crept for the night. Our warm oluk skins kept us perfectly comfortable, and it was only after a most refreshing sleep that we awoke shortly after daylight on the following morning. Already the city was astir, and from several of the gates we saw parties of yellow men emerging. Following closely each detail of the instruction given us by our good friend of Marantina, we remained concealed for several hours until one party of some half-dozen warriors had passed along the trail below our hiding-place and entered the hills by way of the pass along which we had come the previous evening. After giving them time to get well out of sight of our cave, Thuvan Din and I crept out and followed them, overtaking them when they were well into the hills. When we had come almost to them, I called aloud to their leader. When the whole party halted and turned toward us, the crucial test had come. Could we but deceive these men, the rest would be comparatively easy. "Kaor," I cried as I came closer to them. "Kaor," responded the officer in charge of the party. "We be from Ilal," I continued, giving the name of the most remote city of Okar, which has little or no intercourse with Cadabra. "Only yesterday we arrived, and this morning the captain of the gate told us that you were setting out to hunt orluks, which is a sport we do not find in our own neighborhood. We have hastened after you to pray that you allow us to accompany you." The officer was entirely deceived, and graciously permitted us to go with them for the day. The chance guess that they were bound upon an orluk hunt proved correct, and Talul had said that the chances were 10 to 1 that such would be the mission of any party leaving Cadabra by the pass through which we entered the valley, since that way leads directly to the vast plains frequented by this elephantine beast of prey. Insofar as the hunt was concerned, the day was a failure, for we did not see a single Orluk. But this proved more than fortunate for us, since the yellow men were so chagrined by their misfortune that they would not enter the city by the same gate by which they had left it in the morning, as it seemed that they had made great boast to the captain of that gate about their skill at this dangerous sport. We therefore approached Cadabra at a point several miles from that at which the party had quitted it in the morning, and so were relieved of the danger of embarrassing questions and explanations on the part of the gate captain, whom we had said had directed us to this particular hunting party. We had come quite close to the city when my attention was attracted toward a tall, black shaft that reared its head several hundred feet into the air from what appeared to be a tangled mass of junk or wreckage, now partially snow-covered. I did not dare venture an inquiry for fear of arousing suspicion by evident ignorance of something which as a yellow man I should have known, but before we reached the city gate I was to learn the purpose for that grim shaft and the meaning of the mighty accumulation beneath it. We had come almost to the gate when one of the party called to his fellows, at the same time pointing toward the distant southern horizon. Following the direction he indicated, my eyes descried the hull of a large flyer approaching rapidly from above the crest of the encircling hills. "Still other fools who would solve the mysteries of the forbidden north," said the officer, half to himself. "Will they never cease their fatal curiosity?" "Let us hope not," answered one of the warriors, "for then what should we do for slaves and sport?" "True, but what stupid beasts they are to continue to come to a region from whence none of them ever has returned." "Let us tarry and watch the end of this one," suggested one of the men. The officer looked toward the city. "The watch has seen him," he said. "We may remain, for we may be needed." I looked toward the city and saw several hundred warriors issuing from the nearest gate. They moved leisurely, as though there were no need for haste, nor was there, as I was presently to learn. Then I turned my eyes once more toward the flyer. She was moving rapidly toward the city, and when she had come close enough I was surprised to see that her propellers were idle. Straight for that grim shaft she bore. At the last minute I saw the great blades move to reverse her, yet on she came as though drawn by some mighty irresistible power. Intense excitement prevailed upon her deck, where men were running hither and thither, manning the guns and preparing to launch the small one-man flyers, a fleet of which is part of the equipment of every Martian war vessel. Closer and closer to the black shaft the ship sped. In another instant she must strike, and then I saw the familiar signal flown that sends the lesser boats in a great flock from the deck of the mother ship. Instantly 100 tiny flyers rose from her deck, like a swarm of huge dragonflies, but scarcely were they clear of the battleship than the nose of each turned toward the shaft, and they too rushed on a frightful speed toward the same, now seemingly inevitable end that menaced the larger vessel. A moment later the collision came. Men were hurled in every direction from the ship's deck, while she, bent and crumpled, took the last long plunge to the scrap heap at the shaft's base. With her fell a shower of her own tiny flyers, for each of them had come in violent collision with the solid shaft. I noticed that the wrecked flyers scraped down the shaft's side, and that their fall was not as rapid as might have been expected. And then suddenly the secret of the shaft burst upon me, and with it an explanation of the cause that prevented a flyer that passed too far across the ice barrier ever returning. The shaft was a mighty magnet, and when once a vessel came within the radius of its powerful attraction for the aluminum steel that enters so largely into the construction of all Barsoomian craft, no power on earth could prevent such an end as we had just witnessed. I afterward learned that the shaft rests directly over the magnetic pole of Mars, but whether this aids in any way to its incalculable power of attraction I do not know. I am a fighting man, not a scientist. Here, at last, was an explanation of the long absence of Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak. These valiant and intrepid warriors had dared the mysteries and dangers of the frozen north to search for Carthoris, whose long absence had bowed in grief the head of his beautiful mother, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium. The moment that the last of the flyers came to rest at the base of the shaft, the black-bearded yellow warriors swarmed over the mass of wreckage upon which they lay, making prisoners of those who were uninjured and occasionally dispatching with a sword thrust one of the wounded who seemed prone to resent their taunts and insults. A few of the uninjured red men battled bravely against their cruel foes, but for the most part they seemed too overwhelmed by the horror of the catastrophe that had befallen them to do more than submit sublimely to the golden chains with which they were manacled. When the last of the prisoners had been confined, the party returned to the city, at the gate of which we met a pack of fierce, gold-collared Apps, each of which marched between two warriors, who held them with strong chains of the same metal as their collars. Just beyond the gate, the attendants loosened the whole terrible herd, and as they bounded off toward the grim black shaft, I did not need to ask to know their mission. Had there not been those within the cruel city of Cadabra who needed succour far worse than the poor unfortunate dead and dying out there in the cold upon the bent and broken carcasses of 1,000 flyers, I could not have restrained my desire to hasten back and do battle with those horrid creatures that had been dispatched to rend and devour them. As it was, I could but follow the yellow warriors with bowed head, and give thanks for the chance that had given Thuvandin and me such easy ingress to the capital of Silensis Ol. Once within the gates we had no difficulty in eluding our friends of the morning, and presently found ourselves in a Martian hostelry. End of Chapter 9.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 10. In Durance. The public houses of Barsoom, I have found, vary but little. There is no privacy for other than married couples. Men without their wives are escorted to a large chamber, the floor of which is usually of white marble or heavy glass, kept scrupulously clean. Here are many small, raised platforms for the guest's sleeping silks and furs, and if he have none of his own clean, fresh ones are furnished at a nominal charge. Once a man's belongings have been deposited upon one of these platforms, he is a guest of the house, and that platform his own until he leaves. No one will disturb or molest his belongings, as there are no thieves upon Mars. As assassination is the one thing to be feared, the proprietors of the hostelries furnish armed guards, who pace back and forth through the sleeping rooms day and night. The number of guards and the gorgeousness of their trappings quite usually denote the status of the hotel. No meals are served in these houses, but generally a public eating place adjoins them. Baths are connected with the sleeping chambers, and each guest is required to bathe daily or depart from the hotel. Usually, on a second or third floor, there is a large sleeping room for single women guests, but its appointments do not vary materially from the chamber occupied by men. The guards who watch the women remain in the corridor outside the sleeping chamber, while female slaves pace back and forth among the sleepers within, ready to notify the warriors should their presence be required. I was surprised to note that all the guards with the hotel at which we stopped were red men, and on inquiring of one of them I learned that they were slaves purchased by the proprietors of the hotels from the government. The man whose post was past my sleeping platform had been commander of the navy of a great Martian nation, but fate had carried his flagship across the ice barrier within the radius of power of the magnetic shaft, and now for many tedious years he had been a slave of the yellow men. He told me that princes, jeds, and even jedics of the outer world were among the menials who served the yellow race, but when I asked him if he had heard of the fate of Mors Kajak or Tardos Mors, he shook his head, saying that he never had heard of their being prisoners here, though he was very familiar with the reputations and fame they bore in the outer world. Neither had he heard any rumor of the coming of the father of Therns and the Black Dator of the Firstborn. but he hastened to explain that he knew little of what took place within the palace. I could see that he wondered not a little that a yellow man should be so inquisitive about certain red prisoners from beyond the ice barrier, and that I should be so ignorant of customs and conditions among my own race. In fact, I had forgotten my disguise upon discovering a red man pacing before my sleeping platform, but his growing expression of surprise warned me in time, for I had no mind to reveal my identity to any unless some good could come of it, and I did not see how this poor fellow could serve me yet, though I had it in my mind that later I might be the means of serving him and all the other thousands of prisoners who do the bidding of their stern masters in Cadabra. Thuvan Din and I discussed our plans as we sat together among our sleeping silks and furs that night, in the midst of the hundreds of yellow men who occupied the apartment with us. We spoke in low whispers, but, as that is only what courtesy demands in a public sleeping place, we roused no suspicion. At last, determining that all must be but idle speculation until after we had had a chance to explore the city and attempt to put into execution the plan that Talul had suggested, we bade each other good night and turned to sleep. After breakfasting the following morning, we set out to see Cadabra, and as, through the generosity of the Prince of Marantina, we were well supplied with the funds current in Okar, we purchased a handsome ground flyer. Having learned to drive them while in Marantina, we spent a delightful and profitable day exploring the city, and late in the afternoon, at the hour Talul told us we would find government officials in their offices, we stopped before a magnificent building on the plaza opposite the royal grounds and the palace. Here we walked boldly in past the armed guard at the door, to be met by a red slave within who asked our wishes. "Tell Sorav, your master, that 2 warriors from Ilal wish to take service in the palace guard," I said. Sorav, Talul had told us, was the commander of the forces of the palace, and as men from the further cities of Okar, and especially Ilal, were less likely to be tainted with the germ of intrigue which had for years infected the household of Silensis Ol, he was sure that we would be welcomed and few questions asked us. He had primed us with such general information as he thought would be necessary for us to pass muster before Sorav, after which we would have to undergo a further examination before Silensis Ol, that he might determine our physical fitness and our ability as warriors. The little experience we had had with the strange hooked sword of the yellow man and his cup-like shield made it seem rather unlikely that either of us could pass this final test. But there was the chance that we might be quartered in the palace of Silensis Ol for several days after being accepted by Sorav before the Jeddak of Jeddaks would find time to put us to the final test. After a wait of several minutes in an antechamber, we were summoned into the private office of Sorav, where we were courteously greeted by this ferocious-appearing black-bearded officer. He asked us our names and stations in our own city, and having received replies that were evidently satisfactory to him, he put certain questions to us that Talul had foreseen and prepared us for. The interview could not have lasted over 10 minutes when Sorav summoned an aide whom he instructed to record us properly, and then escort us to the quarters in the palace which are set aside for aspirants to membership in the palace guard. The aide took us to his own office first, where he measured and weighed and photographed us simultaneously with a machine ingeniously devised for that purpose, 5 copies being instantly reproduced in 5 different offices of the government, 2 of which are located in other cities miles distant. Then he led us through the palace grounds to the main guardroom of the palace, there turning us over to the officer in charge. This individual again questioned us briefly, and finally dispatched a soldier to guide us to our quarters. These were found located upon the 2nd floor of the palace in a semi-detached tower at the rear of the edifice. When we asked our guide why we were quartered so far from the guardroom, he replied that the custom of the older members of the guard are picking quarrels with aspirants to try their mettle had resulted in so many deaths that it was found difficult to maintain the guard at its full strength while this custom prevailed. Silensis Ol had, therefore, set apart these quarters for aspirants, and here they were securely locked against the danger of attack by members of the guard. This unwelcome information put a sudden check to all our well-laid plans,
for it meant that we should virtually be prisoners in the palace of Silensis Ol until the time that he should see fit to give us the final examination for efficiency. As it was this interval upon which we had banked to accomplish so much in our search for Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Parth, our chagrin was unbounded when we heard the great lock click behind our guide, as he had quitted us after ushering us into the chambers we were to occupy. With a wry face I turned to Thuvan Din. My companion but shook his head disconsolately and walked to one of the windows upon the far side of the apartment. Scarcely had he gazed beyond them than he called to me in a tone of suppressed excitement and surprise. In an instant I was by his side. "Look," said Thuvan Din, pointing toward the courtyard below. As my eyes followed the direction indicated, I saw two women pacing back and forth in an enclosed garden. At the same moment I recognized them. They were Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Parth. There were they whom I had trailed from one pole to another, the length of a world. Only 10 feet of space and a few metal bars separated me from them. With a cry I attracted their attention, and as Dejah Thoris looked up full into my eyes, I made the sign of love that the men of Barsoom make to their women. To my astonishment and horror her head went high, and as a look of utter contempt touched her finely chiseled features, she turned her back full upon me. My body is covered with the scars of 1,000 conflicts, but never in all my long life have I suffered such anguish from a wound, for this time the steel of a woman's look had entered my heart. With a groan I turned away and buried my face in my arms. I heard Thuvan Din call aloud to Thuvia, but an instant later his exclamation of surprise betokened that he too had been repulsed by his own daughter. "They will not even listen," he cried to me. "They have put their hands over their ears and walked to the further end of the garden. Ever heard you of such mad work, John Carter? The two must be bewitched." Presently I mustered the courage to return to the window, for even though she spurned me I loved her, and could not keep my eyes from feasting upon her divine face and figure. But when she saw me looking she again turned away. I was at my wits' end to account for her strange actions, and that Thuvia too had turned against her father seemed incredible. Could it be that my incomparable princess still clung to the hideous faith from which I had rescued her world? Could it be that she looked upon me with loathing and contempt because I had returned from the valley door, or because I had desecrated the temples and persons of the holy Therns? To naught else could I ascribe her strange deportment, yet it seemed far from possible that such could be the case, for the love of Dejah Thoris for John Carter had been a great and wondrous love, far above racial distinctions, creed, or religion. As I gazed ruefully at the back of her haughty, royal head, a gate at the opposite end of the garden opened and a man entered. As he did so he turned and slipped something into the hand of the yellow guardsman beyond the gate. Nor was the distance too great that I might not see that money had passed between them. Instantly I knew that this newcomer had bribed his way within the garden. Then he turned in the direction of the two women, and I saw that he was none other than Thurid, the Black Dator of the Firstborn. He approached quite close to them before he spoke, and as they turned at the sound of his voice I saw Dejah Thoris shrink from him. There was a nasty leer upon his face as he stepped close to her and spoke again. I could not hear his words, but her answer came clearly. "The granddaughter of Tardos Mors can always die," she said, "but she could never live at the price you name." Then I saw the black scoundrel go upon his knees beside her, fairly groveling in the dirt, pleading with her. Only part of what he said came to me, for though he was evidently laboring under the stress of passion and excitement, it was equally apparent that he did not dare raise his voice for fear of detection. "I would save you from Mata Shang," I heard him say. "You know the fate that awaits you at his hand. Would you not choose me rather than the other?" "I would choose neither," replied Dejah Thoris, "even were I free to choose, as you know well I am not." "You are free," he cried. "John Carter, Prince of Helium, is dead." "I know better than that. But even were he dead, and I must needs choose another mate, it should be a plant man or a great white ape in preference to either Mata Shang or you, Black Kalat," she answered with a sneer of contempt. Of a sudden the vicious beast lost all control of himself. As with a vile oath he leaped at the slender woman, gripping her tender throat in his brute clutch.
Thuvia screamed and sprang to aid her fellow prisoner, and at the same instant I too went mad, and tearing at the bars that spanned my window, I ripped them from their sockets as they had been but copper wire. Hurling myself through the aperture, I reached the garden, but 100 feet from where the black was choking the life from Dejah Thoris, and with a single great bound I was upon him. I spoke no word as I tore his defiling fingers from that beautiful throat, nor did I utter a sound as I hurled him 20 feet from me. Foaming with rage, Thurid regained his feet and charged me like a mad bull. "Yellow Man," he shrieked, "you knew not upon whom you had laid your vile hands, but ere I am done with you, you will know well what it means to offend the person of a firstborn." Then he was upon me, reaching for my throat, and precisely as I had done that day in the courtyard of the temple of Isis, I did here in the garden of the palace of Silensis Ol. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me I planted a terrific right upon the side of his jaw. Just as he had done upon that other occasion he did now. Like a top he spun round, his knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. Then I heard a voice behind me. It was the deep voice of authority that marks the ruler of men, and when I turned to face the resplendent figure of a giant yellow man, I did not need to ask to know that it was Silensis Ol. At his right stood Mata Shang, and behind them a score of guardsmen. "Who are you?" he cried, "and what means this intrusion within the precincts of the woman's garden? I do not recall your face. How came you here?" But for his last words I should have forgotten my disguise entirely, and told him outright that I was John Carter, Prince of Helium. But his question recalled me to myself. I pointed to the dislodged bars of the window above. "I am an aspirant to membership in the palace guard," I said, "and from yonder window in the tower where I was confined awaiting the final test for fitness, I saw this brute attack this woman. I could not stand idly by, O Jeddak, and see this thing done within the very palace grounds, and yet feel that I was fit to serve and guard your royal person. I had evidently made an impression upon the ruler of Okar by my fair words, and when he had turned to Dejah Thoris and Thuvia Parth, and both had corroborated my statements, it began to look pretty dark for Thurid. I saw the ugly gleam in Mata Shang's evil eyes as Dejah Thoris narrated all that had passed between Thurid and herself, and when she came to that part which dealt with my interference with the detour of the firstborn, her gratitude was quite apparent, though I could see by her eyes that something puzzled her strangely. I did not wonder at her attitude toward me while others were present, but that she should have denied me while she and Thuvia were the only occupants of the garden still cut me sorely. As the examination proceeded, I cast a glance at Thurid and startled him looking wide-eyed and wonderingly at me, and then of a sudden he laughed full in my face. A moment later Silensis Ol turned toward the black. "What have you to say in explanation of these charges?" he asked, in a deep and terrible voice. "Dare you aspire to one whom the Father of Therns has chosen? One who might even be fit mate for the Jeddak of Jeddaks himself?" And then the black-bearded tyrant turned and cast a sudden greedy look upon Dejah Thoris, as though with the words a new thought and a new desire had sprung up within his mind and breast. Thurid had been about to reply, and with a malicious grin upon his face was pointing an accusing finger at me, when Silensis Ol's words and the expression of his face cut him short. A cunning look crept into his eyes, and I knew from the expression of his face that his next words were not the ones he had intended to speak. "O mightiest of Jeddaks," he said, "the man and the woman do not speak the truth. The fellow had come into the garden to assist them to escape. I was beyond and overheard their conversation, and when I entered, the woman screamed and the man sprang upon me and would have killed me. What know you of this man? He is a stranger to you, and I dare say that you will find him an enemy and a spy. Let him be put on trial, Silensis Ol, rather than your friend and guest, Thurid Detour of the Firstborn." Silensis Ol looked puzzled. He turned again and looked upon Dejah Thoris, and then Thurid stepped quite close to him and whispered something in his ear. What, I know not. Presently the yellow ruler turned to one of his officers. "See that this man be securely confined until we have time to go deeper into this affair," he commanded, "and as bars alone seem inadequate to restrain him, let chains be added." Then he turned and left the garden, taking Dejah Thoris with him, his hand upon her shoulder. Thurid and Mata Shang went also,
and as they reached the gateway the black turned and laughed again aloud in my face. What could be the meaning of his sudden change toward me? Could he suspect my true identity? It must be that, and the thing that had betrayed me was the trick and blow that had laid him low for the second time. As the guards dragged me away, my heart was very sad and bitter indeed, for now to the two relentless enemies that had hounded her for so long another and a more powerful one had been added, for I would have been but a fool had I not recognized the sudden love for Dejah Thoris that had just been born in the terrible breast of Silensis Ol, Jeddak of Jeddaks, ruler of Okar. End of chapter 10.